The question why expertise has failed requires us to consider the possibility that it didn't fail organically. We're seeing the failure of all of our public truth-seeking apparatuses. We're seeing it in journalism, we're seeing it in universities, increasingly we're seeing it in the courts. And you don't need to imagine that people got together in a conference room and decided to destroy truth-seeking. What you need to imagine is that there are a lot of people in some sector who have an interest in being ahead of their competitors and therefore just have an instinctive revulsion at the idea that truth is going to be sought in a university, it's going to be published in journals that everybody can read, and we're all going to then make hay out of it.
Nobody knows how to get rid of
no one knows how to get cows to stop farting.
Exactly, or burping. And if it was a 50% reduction, then you could ignore, okay, leave the cows alone. But because we're trying to avoid the temperature continuing to go up, you do need to go to zero. Otherwise, you're continuing to have temperature increase.
Caroline Metz, Managing Director of Climate Resilience and Health, Intact Center on Climate Adaptation at the University of Waterloo. You have 2 master's degrees and a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering. So when you talk about climate and cool, you are the person, Caroline.
I enjoy the topic, and I think it's a really important time in kind of where we're at with climate, so that people really understand that heat is a risk and it's serious. And we hear a lot about global warming, and the effects of global warming are that it supercharges our weather systems and we get extreme weather, and that includes extreme heat. So these heat events, these heat waves, the heat domes, we're seeing them across the country in places that we didn't have them before, and they're happening more frequently and they're happening more intensely, and people need to prepare.
Well, and when you prepare, so I'll just be truthful and say I love air conditioning. I've always grown up with air conditioning, and so I'm spoiled because a cold house is just always what I've had in the spring and summer. But when we look to trying to stay cool, is air conditioning the wrong answer?
Well, air conditioning has some benefits and some, I don't want to say drawbacks, but there's some concerns in that air conditioning produces waste heat that ends up heating up the outdoor space, and we want to keep our environment as cool as possible. We're already putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, which end up heating our planet. So we do want to kind of keep that in check. And air conditioning uses electricity, and sometimes, folks say, well, it puts extra demand on the grid.
There's a better life for me and you.
Hey everyone, I'm meteorologist David Jones. There are persistent misconceptions about last year's severe weather and its relationship to climate change. I hope this video helps clarify these important issues. During a nasty heat wave in 2009, deaths in the Lower Mainland surged above the weekly average of 280 by 115 people. Shortly thereafter, the BC Centre for Disease Control and the health authorities developed a rigorous extreme heat alerting protocol. With their help, I began training forecasters in the protocol because it turns out vulnerable people in the Lower Mainland will die after 2 days in a row of temperatures above 36 at Abbotsford. In 2008, the Justice Institute approached me. We're doing an exercise. Can you dream up a hypothetical extreme weather scenario that sends most of BC into emergency response mode? Why, of course, said I immediately. Why don't we just use a historical event, but shift the landfall into the worst possible place, somewhere in the Lower Mainland? That would surely create a nightmare of impacts. We even made a fakey newscast for the exercise. Thanks, Darren. Many of you may remember the tropical punch storm of mid-January 2005. That's when an incredibly wet tropical weather system crashed through southern BC, shutting down transportation routes, knocking out the power, and isolating many communities. In 2013, a workshop on atmospheric rivers was held in Victoria. I attended. In 2014, a report on the workshop was published. From part 4 of this report, titled Enhancing Our Response, Identifying vulnerabilities and emergency management needs in advance could reduce risks to communities. Climate change had nothing to do with the atmospheric river, nor did it cause the heat wave. There are 3 bins into which extreme weather nonsense can safely be placed. Think of them as trash baskets. The first is the argument from experience bin. This can is for every argument resembling the following. We've never seen this before. Typical proponents? Journalists, news anchors, also dewy-eyed junior forecasters, and meteorologists that are not actually meteorologists but play one on TV. The second bin is for arguments from authority. These are the pompous pronouncements from experts in anything but operational meteorology on the West Coast. Here, you can also toss any arguments from scientists who are more activists than scientists. Science activism is accelerating to scale and should not be acceptable anywhere the church is separated from the state. The third is the argument from small sample size bin. Here, you can safely deposit all arguments that use dubious statistical methods to overcome that which cannot be overcome. Small sample size. I only know these truths because it was my job to be directly in the middle of all of it. And for everyone else, whenever you hear a claim about West Coast weather and a causal relationship to climate change, if it's not coming from a proper meteorologist with decades of experience here, ask yourself, into which of the 3 bins should that claim be placed?
Now, my girl, you're so young and pretty.
Thanks for having me, Tom, and for what you do. I think your podcast aggregates the best minds on everything to do with the climate and is a legacy for the ages, to say nothing of your movie. I often refer people to this show, so it really is an honor. I grew up in North Vancouver, 4 minutes from the Grouse Mountain gondola, where I chased fresh snow all winter, calling the weather office every day. My Irish father grew up during the war and revered great speakers like Winston Churchill. I do too, although I find communication enormously challenging. Just ask my wife. So I have a fondness for fresh snow and words. Early in my 32-year career with Canada's Weather Service, I realized a perfect forecast can be useless if the client doesn't know exactly what it means. That notion shaped the course of my career as a public servant and as a broadcaster. I strove to ensure every audience understood everything so they could make better decisions. I ended up in a position entirely about communication, the warning preparedness meteorologist for coastal British Columbia. The WPM is a spokesperson doing outreach mostly about severe weather, the main clients being the media and the emergency planning community. I also focused on the marine and avalanche communities, and I thought I was succeeding wildly with everyone until the 2010 Southern Straits sailing disaster, when I learned just how challenging communication really is. I retired in 2017. The workplace had changed a lot since I began in 1985, and not for the better. I'd never survived the Orwellian state of Environment and Climate Change Canada today, which used to be known simply as Environment Canada, or EC. I don't use the new name, which is classic Orwell, a federal government department about something and nothing all at once. I'm not the only retiree hoping that brand name gumbo reverts to EC with the next government. In 2018, 18 months after retiring, I became a contract fire weather forecaster for the BC Wildfire Service. I was fascinated by fire weather, but had no experience. I quickly learned why fire weather is the most important sub-discipline of weather in BC. Upon retiring from fire weather in 2021, I turned full-time to my youthful passion, chasing powder. This time at Whistler. Only now, I am the weather office, sharing my powder insights with everyone. If someone told me back in 2017 everything you did helping people understand weather will be quickly and enthusiastically undone by your former colleagues and your clients, well, I might have believed them if they'd also told me the world would be on the brink of hysteria unmatched in human history. I'll outline 2 international weather stories, then back up and dig into the truth from an insider's perspective. After all, my branding slogan is speaking truth to powder. In the days before the June 2021 heat wave, Canadian weather models forecast temperatures beyond the pale of previous extremes, way beyond. The forecast temperatures were 4 to 5 degrees higher than a previous deadly heat wave in 2009 and would last longer than any heat wave on record here. Anyone familiar with the research supporting the first evidence-based weather alerting threshold in Weather Service history could scarcely believe the implication. Conservatively, at least 115 people were going to die unless everyone acted together immediately. But the upper limit of death, one could only speculate. I could find nothing warning or spelling out what experienced meteorologists knew was about to happen. Then on November 15th, 2021, during a classic West Coast monsoon storm cycle with disastrous flooding and massive infrastructure damage from the first storm, newly branded as an atmospheric river, and merely months removed from the deadliest Canadian heat wave we know of, also rebranded as a heat dome, the Weather Service proceeded to unwittingly spread terror throughout southwestern British Columbia. Here's some definitions and presumptions to get started. MT, a Canadian meteorologist. Journalist, a professional storyteller. Threat-sensitive populations, women and children. Pretendologist, a brazen academic or status seeker with no operational weather forecasting training or experience, posing as a weather expert. Climate, the statistics of weather, the SOW. Climate is the sow. Think adult female swine. The best way to understand the difference between weather and the sow is to understand one exists and the other doesn't. The best way to understand sow scientists is that they're experts in something that doesn't exist. The word for sow is too vague for science. It fosters a fundamental misconception that the sow is a thing and that cause and effect are reversed. The sow does not exist, except as other abstractions, numbers, in a spreadsheet. It's an abstraction made of other abstractions. Viewed this way, the sow is clearly and obviously a consequence of the weather derived from the weather, not the cause of it. Sow hysteria is driven by experts in something that doesn't exist and by professional storytellers misconceptualizing. If your goal is to understand weather and sow, use the phrase, not the word, and ask the proper expert, a meteorologist. In the future, sow science will disappear because any discipline with the word science in the name always ends up having nothing to do with science. And all of us are really tired of science being used as an authority for leveraging the latest fad. As far as I can tell, I'm the only meteorologist in Canada speaking publicly and contrarily about changes in the sow. There are plenty of other Canadian MTs with heterodox views. Some are friends. Nonetheless, north of 49 degrees, there's social media, TV, print, and radio silence. In the U.S., there's a surplus of heterodox MTs speaking publicly. I see them on Twitter every day. I see 21-year-old undergraduate Chris Martz speaking loudly, clearly, and brilliantly, and taking it on the chin for doing so. That's courage. Is there a difference between Canadian and American MTs and the students determined to join them? I think so, and it looks like something to do with personality traits, specifically passivity and passion. To be fair, I'm very comfortable communicating in any medium. In Canada, I can think of 2 other operational MTs with similar experience in the media. And it's not like the Canadian professional storytellers are going around surveying all of us. No one ever forgets that when there are questions to be asked about cars, it's best to consult a mechanic. Professional storytellers in Canada have forgotten the obvious about the sow. I think the environment where Canadian MTs develop is important. Most learn operational weather forecasting working for the Federal Weather Service. It's a workplace where accountability has diminished to nearly zero, and being accountable means speaking up. It's the only place an apprentice MT can acquire the broad experience required to become a competent all-around forecaster. In this profession, that means working various desks serving distinct clients' needs. The desks are typically the public, marine, aviation, summer severe weather, and back in the day, forestry and consultation desks. When I apprenticed, the chief meteorologist read every forecast. If your grammar, spelling, or content was not near perfect, there was a fireside chat with the chief in your near future. Everyone knew who wrote every forecast, the great ones and the clunkers, because we tagged them with our initials. A healthy, broad experience in weather includes engaging the customers, which creates accountability. That was accomplished by answering the phone and through regular radio broadcasts and TV interviews. Becoming a public face in the weather game is highly underrated by most MTs. It fosters even more accountability. Those of us who've had FaceTime know how critical it is to understand and respond to the customer. Once they recognize you, they want to talk, and from the talking, you learn a lot. Staff were once specifically trained to do all of this, but almost all such accountability fostering tasks have disappeared. The Weather Service was an imperfect but competent, accountable, science-based, trusted organization. It served Canadians, and despite the sarcasm that always accompanies weather prediction, they knew it. But government interference has incrementally increased corruption. The new mission: disseminate the ideology of the minister and protect the minister at all costs. It's now primarily a political organization with a side of service, propagandizing at every opportunity, integrity desperately wanting. The last spike in the corpse of credibility and accountability delivered by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau himself, appointing activist Stephen Guilbeault Minister of Environment and Sow Change Canada. Canadian weather is now in the hands of a man who believes carbon dioxide is a pollutant, a 21st century Lysenko, only less qualified. A man who scaled the CN Tower in Toronto and hung a banner labeling Canada and George Bush sow killers, guilty of murdering an abstraction. And the timing fit, October 26, 2021, just as systemic rot manifest as death on the West Coast. The heat wave and pineapple as outcomes of sow change is a convenient smokescreen for the failures of Canada's Weather Service. Thinking like a scientist is a simple concept that's very hard to embody. It's harder than you'd believe and more difficult than scientists accept. For example, there is no evidence human-added CO2 is harmful or changing the weather. That should be enough for any scientist or anyone who thinks like one. It's not. Obviously, the issue is not about evidence. Severe weather alerting is the holy grail of meteorology. It's the primary reason for the existence of national weather services. There is no more important task than warning the public about incoming tornadoes, lightning, hurricanes, blizzards, heat waves, or extreme rainfalls. It's the reason, and may soon be the only reason, MTs have jobs. It's why deaths from weather have declined precipitously since 1900. Current global death rates from weather disasters are lower than at any time in recorded history. Motivating people to take action to protect themselves or their property is a complex task. It's as much about psychology and communication as it is about weather expertise. The basic format of a warning is 1. Identify the threat and the timeline, and 2. Identify potential impacts and suggest actions that may reduce those impacts. Heat alerting stands alone as the weather event for which MTs can have demonstrable life-saving impact. There are precise, evidence-based critical thresholds, and temperature itself is highly predictable. How much rain causes death? How much snow or wind guarantees death? No one can tell, but above a certain threshold, heat kills. When deadly heat threatens, part 2 of the warning becomes A. Emphatically explain that people will die. B. Disclose how many died the last time heat reached this level. And then C. Urgently and personally suggest concrete actions to save lives. If there is a time for an MT to be emotive, then this is it. MTs prognosticate with a purpose, and it's not entertainment or professional storytelling. It's to save lives and property. We know flooding the market with low threshold alerts or hysteria reduces the value and efficacy of the next alert, leading to complacency and inaction, and in the case of heat, guaranteed death. We know there's a time for silence, to shut up about weather risks. The boy who cried wolf is a lesson we've not forgotten. When I was with CTV in Vancouver, consultants critiqued the performances of anchors and reporters. I was told, Dave, what I like about your weather is that you don't oversell it. At the time, I found that odd. Why would I oversell the weather? I'll be back here tomorrow having to answer for it. Besides that, I represent a weather service with a clear purpose that selling would just undermine and bring ridicule to my colleagues. Proper MTs are wary of the oversell, knowing the more you respect it and the less you use it, the more effective it'll be when you need to. Professional storytellers can oversell every day, but a deadly heat wave is the right time for a professional MT to set their hair on fire, to sell it. Billions of people are now captives to the most hyperbolic, relentless oversell in the history of peoplekind. That their futures are threatened by severe weather, especially heat. This lie, wrapped up in a delusion, is unhelpful to the project of MTs. A former colleague, a sow scientist, International Panel on Sow Change author, now writes a blog whose front page proudly proclaims, "You know those 99% of scientists you keep hearing about? Well, I'm one of those. Ignoring issues of reputational suicide and the Dangerfield isms that shameless confession conjures, would Rodney be in or out of that club? In tedious bloggings about fossil fuel bogeymen and the crisis, my ex-colleague overemploys a pretentious phrase, what is/what isn't. In honor of these pretentious declarations, here's what weather is/sow is/isn't. Weather forecasting is about deciphering what's causing what. It begins by defining the what's. I presume everyone knows what weather is: wind in face, rain in eyes, snowflakes in headlights, the heat of the sun on your back. Weather is tangible. You can touch it and it can touch you. Almost no one, including most scientists, knows what the sow is. Confusing weather and the sow is not new, but it is a new normal. And I see no effort by jabbering mannequins anywhere to clarify the difference. National Geographic doesn't know. This is a typical failure. The sow is the long-term pattern of weather in a particular area. Weather can change from hour to hour, day to day, month to month, or even year to year. A region's weather patterns, usually tracked for at least 30 years, are considered its sow. You kind of sort of get an idea of what maybe Nat Geo means by that definition. But when a definition requires more space explaining what the sow isn't than what it is, you should probably find another dictionary. Two extreme weather stories feeding the hysteria and capturing world attention in 2021 occurred in my domain: the heat wave and the Pineapple Express. Non-experts in West Coast meteorology and professional storytellers call these the heat dome and the atmospheric river. Heat dome is not a Canadian weather term. Atmospheric river is a term unknown to Canadians until 2021. Both events are repeatedly miscast as obvious examples of changes in the sow. That's just wrong and negligently so. Worse, there has been no investigation into the miserable failing of alerting in the heat wave. It was a meteorologist's worst nightmare. A weather alert for a very predictable severe event failed to trigger public or institutional action to prevent death. Back in 2010, my role as WPM made me lead for a project initiated by the BC Centre for Disease Control, Vancouver Coastal Health, and the Fraser Health Authority. A heat wave in 2009 caused a spike in the weekly death rate, and these agencies wanted to partner and build an evidence-based extreme heat alerting program based on new research done by the CDC. The goal? To prevent a repeat of the 115 deaths attributed to the 2009 event. Within 2 years, an extreme heat warning program was operational in the Weather Office using Abbotsford maximum temperatures as a proxy for the entire lower mainland. It turns out that temperatures exceeding 36 Celsius on consecutive days at Abbotsford causes death. 36 Celsius is 97 Fahrenheit. We called it the Abbotsford Rule. There were two levels. One, if forecast temperatures exceeded 32 Celsius, 90 Fahrenheit, on consecutive days at Abbotsford, a special weather statement is issued. 2, if forecast temperatures exceeded 36 Celsius, 97 Fahrenheit, after consulting the health partners, an extreme heat warning is issued. Level 1 is a heads up about incoming beach weather. Level 2 guarantees a spike in the weekly death rate unless immediate steps are taken by everyone, especially those responsible for elderly and compromised people. The Level 2 warning included explicit messages explaining a death spike rivaling 2009 was guaranteed, unless actions were taken to protect older and vulnerable people. 115 potential deaths. There is no room for waffle words in the case of an evidence-based threshold for deadly heat. So what happened in 2021 when a deadly heat warning was needed for a once-in-an-MT's lifetime extreme heat wave? Was this not a perfect opportunity to activate Level 2, a level never reached since the program was put in place, so rare is that type of heat? To make sense of this debacle, we need to back up to 2018 when, to the surprise of the health partners, the Weather Service unilaterally jettisoned the extreme heat warning program, dismissing local research, lowering alerting thresholds, and adding another variable to the alerting equation, even though local research had shown no correlation to it. Where the lower thresholds came from, we can only speculate. The consequence of that ill-advised move announced itself immediately in the form of multiple meaningless, confusing, low-threshold beach weather warnings in the summer of 2019 and 2020. The coordinated communication channel between MTs and the health partners became garbled. On Wednesday, June 23, 2021, with heat death incoming, forecasters issued the new nationally coordinated heat warning for this extraordinary event. Unfortunately, it took the health partners 2 days to catch up to the significance of the heat on their doorstep. And the warning text made no reference to the Abbotsford Rule or included any of the no-nonsense text we created to make the "people are going to die" message unambiguous. The Abbotsford Rule has tremendous power to motivate action because it's so easy to understand, the action being, right now, go help your grandparents and anyone else that might be vulnerable to heat none of us have ever felt before. Go! By swapping a regionally appropriate extreme heat warning program for a generic national system, the Weather Service caused a horrendous heat wave warning failure. MTs did their job, but a terrible decision by Weather Service Management and Health Canada in 2018 resulted in a death toll from weather unheard of in Canada's history. This is, hands down, the worst weather warning I've seen in 40 years of weather. It was issued on Wednesday that week, and in the context of what I just described, this bulletin served no one. Today it serves as evidence of negligence by the Meteorological Service of Canada. I feel as angry, helpless, and hopeless reading that warning now as I did when I anticipated this very outcome in 2016. That was when I caught wind. Our barely out-of-the-box, evidence-based extreme heat warning program might be undone by Environment and Sound Change Canada and Health Canada. I had no idea 615 people would pay for it with their lives. This warning misses the mark so badly for all its utility, it might as well have been transmitted in Morse code. There was nothing unprecedented about the atmospheric river of 2021 except where it landed and how it was branded. In the rainstorm cycle of November 2021, the Weather Service made a terrible labeling decision by labeling storms 2 and 3 in the cycle atmospheric rivers, the same name they gave Storm 1, which was a bona fide pineapple. The public, just coming to terms with an astonishing June heat wave, could only imagine a watery Armageddon on the horizon. Never mind that Storms 2 and 3 were just typical West Coast rainstorms that were, technically speaking, for all the technicians in the audience, within the genre known only to technicians as atmospheric rivers. In 40 years, I've never seen 2 worse communication failures than occurred in 2021. In October of 2003, a pineapple hit the sea to sky corridor just north of the Lower Mainland. It was a juicy doozy, as far as we can tell, because it's always impossible to precisely measure or quantify extreme weather of any type. The 2003 pineapple dropped between 400 and 600 millimeters of rain, that's 15 to 24 inches, which was beyond the experience of anyone in the weather office at that time. So, how often does this happen was a legit question. After much head-scratching and pestering from professional storytellers for an easy-to-consume oversimplification of the disaster, someone decided the Gumbel distribution might provide a sciencey-sounding return period answer we could float. But in the end, to the amateur statisticians in the weather office, the Gumbel-derived solution seemed just too big. And being proper scientists, we arbitrarily cut the value in half, declaring a 1 in 200-year rainstorm. Everyone went home happy that day and turned on the telly, where our story-friendly fabrication was in the headline of every lead story in every newscast that night. Mission accomplished. Or so we thought. Then, 1.25 years later, 15 months, another ill-intentioned rainstorm slammed the sea-to-sky corridor, wiping out the ski season across a large chunk of the province in January 2005. Both of those storms produced more rain than the so-called unprecedented 2021 storm, more than twice as much in the case of the 2003 storm. And I haven't even mentioned the uncelebrated rainstorms of 2010 at Bella Coola or 2012 in Alaska, or a slew of other washouts dating back to the 19th century, or for that matter, to the Roman warm period. Imagine. For the workshop in 2013, tropical fruit guru Marty Ralph and his crew of Fruitopian experts came north to share their knowledge and expertise with Canadians. The big fear here was that inevitably an oversized pineapple would eventually land in the worst possible place, the Lower Mainland. The term atmospheric river is jargon, a technical term the public heard for the first time in 2021, and about which every Canadian remains as confused now as they were then. And just wait. The Lower Mainland is the most densely populated and infrastructured real estate on Canada's west coast. It includes Vancouver, one of the world's most expensive cities. Vancouver has stunning geography inside city limits, mountains rising steeply from sea level, a protected inland sea, glorious islands to the west, to the east, a lowland transportation corridor through the province's largest agricultural region, leading to steep mountain passes connecting the coast with the rest of Canada. The corridor is formed by mountain ranges narrowing into a V-trap, a natural funnel that forces moisture-laden air up and over those passes. The spout of the funnel is the town of Hope, so named because given the annual rainfall, you need plenty of it to live there. Meteorologists often remark it rains more in Hope after the storm passes. Such is the power of inflowing, converging streams of Pacific air behind storms. The physical geography exposes the area to many natural hazards, especially the mayhem weather routinely produces, and mostly in the rainy season, November and December, when monsoonish storm cycles can send 2, 3, 5, 7 storms slamming into the Coast Range. In terms of surging river flows and flooding, the damage from tropical storms scales up in early winter season storms known as rain-on-snow events. Warm air overrunning subtropical air with skyrocketing freezing levels reaches the highest peaks of the Coast Range. The immature snowpack is not deep enough yet to absorb the rain, and in the super warm air, it's vulnerable to a complete meltdown. The melting snowpack plus long-duration subtropical rainfall rates from a river of water stalled overhead races towards sea level through coastal drainages. Pineapple status is granted if the river of rain parks itself for 18 to 36 hours. Tropical punch status needs 72 hours or more, and more happens. The lower mainland, in terms of potential dollar damage from rivers of rain in the sky, is a scaled-down version of California's Sacramento Valley. In California, an MT's worst nightmare features a river of rain in the sky stalling over the Sacramento Valley, actuating the most expensive disaster in the history of mankind. That's why, in 2013, the world experts in tropical fruit came north to Victoria for the workshop. If there's one thing we may reasonably presume, it's this. In the thousands of years of habitation on this coast, a fair share of rainstorms reaching tropical fruit status have landed on the lower mainland. For all we know, the first First Nations branded them the Salmonberry Express. I'm kidding, of course, but good grief. What stunted narcissistic view of time, space, and history is needed to label any weather unprecedented? That's the definition of parochial in the world of professional weather prediction. More frequent and more intense. Back in the day, this phrase had some truth to it, and it sold a lot of vibrators. Those models worked, unlike Sal models, which sell a lot of fantasy weather porn, but produce zero satisfaction. Regarding claims of increasing frequency and intensity of pineapples based on Sal models, listen to Marty Ralph, global expert. Quote, while all models project increases in the frequency of atmospheric river conditions, the results also illustrate uncertainties in the details of the projections of this key phenomenon, highlighting the need to better understand why models' representations of atmospheric rivers vary. Unquote. Note Ralph's reference to projections of atmospheric river conditions and representations of atmospheric rivers as distinct from actual atmospheric rivers, which cannot be predicted by Sal models. And roughly 95% of the models selling more frequent and more intense pineapples and everything else presume RCP 8.5, only recently rejected by believers despite being binned long ago by contrarians as a pornographic projection of fossil fuel use. And by the way, the guy leading the charge against the oafishness of RCP 8.5 happens to work right here in Vancouver. I've never seen Justin interviewed by professional storytellers, by the way. Then again, the University of British Columbia can be hard to find. When you hear an expert go straight to the uncertainty discussion, as Ralph does here, you can be confident the expert is actually an expert. Proper experts always speak to the uncertainty, usually first. They acknowledge the presumptions their models, conceptual models, and predictions are based upon. You see this in the weather office, everywhere. It's what distinguishes the best forecasters from all the rest. In the TV news biz, the best reporters are the best storytellers. Some folks have a God-given talent for turning a story about nothing into 2 minutes of drama. Most professional storytellers don't, and it gets complicated when they're assigned a story that isn't really a story. They still need to produce 2 minutes of content ready for prime time by the day's end. I spent lots of time telling professional storytellers, don't bother coming to interview me because there's nothing to see here. It's just weather being weather. That set the tone for the interview because they're coming anyway. They'll just tweak and clip whatever you give them to suit whatever angle they must now spin the story into. Or they'll just come and clip you with no audio at all, because sound down video provides evidence of due diligence too. It's easier to reject or maneuver these invitations to your 2 minutes of fame once you've had a little. And the longer you've worked closely with the media, the easier it gets. It takes time to recognize that being a spokesperson is not the same thing as being a good spokesperson. It's especially not the same as being an ethical spokesperson. To get there, most people have to fail a lot. And failing that way is not really surprising in a weather service whose most famous weatherman is not even a weatherman. On the other hand, Marty Ralph gets it. He's an expert, and he chooses his words very carefully. Since 2021, every opportunist and way too many professional storytellers subject us all to endless fool's commentary about heat waves and pineapples being evidence the weather has changed. It's changed all right, but only in the sense that any weather is now just an opportunity for propagandic oversell. It's changed in that you could be forgiven for thinking there is no such thing as real weather anymore, just endless chattering about an abstraction, the statistics of weather, the SOW. The worst blathercasting comes from SOW modelers, who know very little about the practical application of models, uncertainty, ethical communication, and what Niels Bohr meant when he said prediction is very difficult, especially when it's about the future. Little wonder SOW modelers make such good politicians. MTs must determine twice a day when a model's reliability has reached zero, i.e. the moment in time after which no useful information about the future can be extracted. We then publicly address that ever-shifting moment with verifiable predictions. Unlike SOW modelers, MTs are, every day, confronted by the accountability born of verification. Caution and humility are taught and learned on the job, because verification is critical to learning the weather. SOW modelers escape the pain and the pro-tip teaching moments only verification can provide. Pretendologists of any stripe embody none of the restraint real MTs acquire because Mother Nature beats it into us. We know exactly where hyperbole ends in prediction, in a club that won't have you. A particularly annoying pretendologist archetype is the attribution play-by-play men breaching the university swamp in the aftermath of any weather slightly left or right of normal, spewing tales of new normal weather terror. The CBC and other professional storytellers are only too happy to collaborate, providing a publicly funded platform for terrorizing the public by interviewing, re-interviewing, and recycling scare porn produced by this go-to syndicate of fear-mongering catastrophizers. Adding insult to injury for passive Canadian MTs, CBC and other professional storytellers shamelessly pretend the syndicate is the authority on the SOW, and that the pretendologist at the anchor desk is a real meteorologist. All this meteorological meekness is not good for the team or the brand of Canadian MTs. I recently discovered ground zero for Canadian weather nonsense. It's a high-output factory of histrionic weather lies on LinkedIn. It's called the Intact Center at the University of Waterloo. The Intact Emperor, without blushing, directs a meteorological pornification machine publicly fetishizing the new LinkedIn Kington, scaring threat-sensitive populations. All of it is ruinous to the credibility and project of real meteorologists. What do we hear? Silence. The summary is not pretty. In June 2021, Canada's Weather Service, whose mission is to alert Canadians to severe weather threatening life and property, botched deadly heat alerting in British Columbia when it was needed most. 619 people died, the largest death toll in the country's weather history. No investigation into this abject failure was undertaken. Later that year, the Weather Service unleashed the worst communications havoc in Canada's weather history in the middle of the costliest and second most deadly natural disaster in the history of British Columbia. No investigation into this abject failure was undertaken. Post-event, every level of government sought cover from the intense reflection of their planning failures behind a smokescreen of atmospheric river propaganda, calling the storm unprecedented despite two well-publicized heavier rainstorms in the previous 20 years, and countless others in the previous century. Also, in October 2021, in the most cynical appointment in Canadian political history, an activist once dubbed the Green Jesus of Montreal becomes Minister of Environment and Sow Change Canada, the science-based department overseeing the Weather Service. Damage to the credibility of the department will be unearthed for years to come. If nothing else, an investigation into how an activist can be put in charge of a science-based government department is warranted. Today, accountability in the most important project of MTs has completely vanished. The weather warning space, formerly the private domain of meteorologists, has been polluted by the endless, senseless hyperbole of amateurs, academics, and other pretendologists. The primary project of Canadian meteorologists communicating severe weather warnings is in jeopardy, and there is no reason for Canadians to think or hope that anything will change in the Weather Service. Even if a new Conservative government guts DEI, the Weather Service will still be run by a management class who offered no resistance to it, happily and brainlessly climbing onto the climate alarmism bandwagon of the woke left. Meteorologists remain passive and mute through all of it. The undertaker might as well be at the door. I have seen relatives of people who died in the heatwave in their grief take up the pledge of fighting the sow. I am very sorry for your loss. I can tell you the probability that changes in the statistics of weather had anything to do with your loved one's death is zero. But the probability that negligence on the part of the Meteorological Service of Canada led to their death is extremely high. It did not have to happen, and if you are in any mood whatsoever to pursue the truth of the deadly heatwave, I will do whatever I can to support you with the facts and with help asking the right questions of the right people. I don't know all the facts yet, but I know many truths certain agencies would rather not talk about. To my colleagues in Canadian weather, as someone named Francis Chan said, our greatest fear should not be failure, but of succeeding at things that don't really matter. The Weather Service succeeds at a lot of things that don't really matter. The deadly heat wave still matters to the people who lost loved ones. It matters for your future because the Weather Service will do it again. And if you don't know that, you haven't been there long enough. It's past time for a review of past failures that do matter. I hope this Tom Nelson podcast rattles and provokes Canadian meteorologists and everyone in the Weather Service where most are employed. All of them need to wake up, stand up straight, pull their shoulders back, and start speaking truth to an atmosphere of nonsense.